Hi, I'm a reporter with the Oregonian. I wanted to get your side on the Christian murdered his entire family.
Why are you telling me this?
Because when they apprehended him, he said he was...
Did he say anything at all about why he claimed to be me?
In the early 2000s, a story emerged from the uneasy intersection of crime, identity, and journalism that felt less like a conventional investigation and more like a psychological spiral, one that blurred the boundaries between truth and invention in ways that still feel unsettling. It begins with Michael Finkel, a journalist whose career once seemed to be on a steady rise, writing compelling feature stories that placed him in respected publications and earned him a reputation for immersive storytelling. Finkel had a talent for entering worlds that most people would never see, translating human behavior into narrative form with a clarity that made his work stand out. But that career momentum abruptly fractured when one of his most celebrated articles was exposed as partially fabricated. The revelation didn't just damage his credibility, it dismantled his professional identity entirely. In the world of journalism, where trust is the currency that sustains every sentence, even a single breach can echo for years, and Finkel found himself cast out, his name now associated with cautionary tales rather than literary skill. At almost the same time, another story was unfolding in a very different register, one that would eventually collide with Finkel's life in ways no one could have predicted. Christian Longo, a man from Oregon with a seemingly ordinary suburban background, had become one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives after being accused of murdering his wife and 3 children. The brutality of the crime shocked investigators, but what made Longo especially elusive was not just the act itself, but his ability to disappear afterward. He fled the United States and assumed a new identity, eventually living in Mexico under the name Michael Finkel, ironically borrowing the identity of the disgraced journalist without either of them knowing it at the time. This strange coincidence of names would become the thread that stitched their lives together, transforming an already disturbing crime story into something far more psychologically complex. When Longo was eventually captured in Mexico, the media coverage intensified, focusing on the horrifying details of the murders and the mystery of his time on the run. It was during this period that Michael Finkel, the real Michael Finkel, discovered that his name had been used as a disguise by a man accused of one of the most shocking family murders in recent memory. The discovery was not just bizarre, it felt almost surreal, as if reality had folded in on itself in a way that demanded attention. For Finkel, whose own identity had recently been dismantled by professional disgrace, the idea that someone else had been living under his name while he struggled to reclaim his career created an emotional and intellectual tension that he could not ignore. Instead of rejecting the connection, he made a decision that would define the next phase of his life. He sought out Christian Longo in prison. The correspondence between them began cautiously, through letters that carried the weight of 2 damaged identities converging in an enclosed space of ink and paper. Longo, already facing the possibility of life imprisonment or worse, seemed to recognize in Finkel a rare opportunity, not necessarily for redemption, but for explanation. Finkel, on the other hand, approached the exchange with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He had been burned by the consequences of bending truth in his own work, and now he was engaging with a man whose relationship to truth had been defined by alleged deception on a far more devastating scale. Yet what unfolded between them was not a simple confrontation of journalist and criminal. It became something more ambiguous, a psychological exchange in which each man seemed to reflect aspects of the other's fractured identity. As the communication deepened, Finkel traveled to the prison to meet Longo in person. The setting itself reinforced the gravity of the situation, a controlled environment designed to contain individuals who had been removed from society. Yet within those walls, conversations about memory, motive, and identity unfolded with unexpected intimacy. Longo presented himself as articulate, composed, and reflective, offering his version of events with a clarity that complicated any simple moral reading of his case. He spoke about his life, his decisions, and the path that led to the crime, while also maintaining a guarded distance from full emotional exposure. Finkel, trained to observe and interpret, found himself caught between journalistic detachment and a growing psychological entanglement with the subject in front of him. The dynamic between them became the core of what would later be transformed into the 2015 drama True Story, directed by Rupert Gold and based on Finkel's own memoir. The film adaptation brought together actors James Franco as Christian Longo and Jonah Hill as Michael Finkel, with Felicity Jones playing Finkel's partner, who becomes an emotional anchor as the narrative tension intensifies. The casting itself added another layer of interpretation to the story, as Franco's portrayal of Longo emphasized an unsettling calmness beneath the surface, while Hill's performance as Finkel leaned into restraint and internal conflict rather than outward dramatization. The result was a film that did not rely on traditional crime thriller structures, but instead focused on the psychological terrain between two men bound by an unusual convergence of identity and circumstance. Within the narrative, Longo's past is gradually reconstructed through dialogue and recollection, revealing a portrait of a man who struggled with financial instability, personal ambition, and the pressures of constructing a stable family life. The murders themselves remain an unresolved emotional gravity throughout the story, never fully explained in a way that satisfies conventional expectations of motive or closure. Instead, the film explores how individuals attempt to narrate their own actions and how those narratives can be shaped by self-preservation, denial, or fragmented memory. Finkel's role in this process becomes increasingly complicated, as he is no longer simply documenting another person's story, but actively participating in its construction. As the investigation continues, Finkel's professional instincts re-emerge, but they are now entangled with personal stakes. He is not just reporting on a criminal case, he is attempting to salvage his own credibility by engaging with a subject that carries inherent public fascination. The FBI's involvement in Longo's capture adds procedural weight to the story, but the emotional core remains confined to the evolving relationship between journalist and subject. In many ways, both men are negotiating forms of imprisonment, one literal, the other psychological. Longo is physically confined within the prison system, while Finkel is constrained by the collapse of his professional reputation and the need to understand what truth means in a world where narratives can be manipulated or misunderstood. The presence of Felicity Jones's character introduces another dimension to this tension, as she represents a perspective grounded outside the obsessive focus of the investigation. Her concerns about Finkel's growing fixation highlight the emotional cost of his engagement with Longo, suggesting that the pursuit of understanding can sometimes come at the expense of personal stability. This dynamic adds a quieter but essential layer to the story, emphasizing that the consequences of such an investigation extend beyond the prison walls and into the intimate spaces of everyday life. What makes the story of True Story particularly compelling is not just the crime at its center, but the philosophical questions it raises about identity, authorship, and the human need to be understood. The coincidence of Longo adopting Finkel's name becomes more than a narrative curiosity. It becomes a symbolic convergence of two men whose lives have both been destabilized by truth and deception in different forms. One is accused of constructing lies that led to irreversible tragedy, while the other is accused of distorting truth in a professional context that undermined public trust. Their interaction becomes a mirror in which each sees distorted reflections of the other. As the narrative progresses toward its final stages, the psychological distance between Finkel and Longo narrows in unsettling ways. Conversations that begin as journalistic inquiry begin to resemble something closer to confessional exchange, though neither man fully relinquishes control over his own narrative. Longo's demeanor oscillates between openness and strategic ambiguity, leaving Finkel to interpret meaning from fragments of testimony and behavioral cues. The tension lies not in uncovering a definitive explanation for the crime, but in the recognition that such explanations may never fully exist in a satisfying or complete form. The broader implications of the story extend into the nature of storytelling itself, particularly in journalism and cinema. The act of reconstructing reality through narrative inevitably involves selection, emphasis, and interpretation, all of which introduce subjective elements into what is often assumed to be objective truth. Finkel's journey reflects this tension as he moves from disgraced journalist to author of a work that blurs the lines between reporting and introspection. The film adaptation amplifies this ambiguity, presenting events through a cinematic lens that emphasizes mood, silence, and psychological pressure rather than explicit resolution. James Franco's portrayal of Christian Longo captures a figure who is simultaneously composed and opaque, suggesting intelligence without offering full emotional transparency. Jonah Hill's performance as Michael Finkel, meanwhile, grounds the narrative in a quieter form of tension, one that unfolds through observation, hesitation, and gradual immersion into a world that resists easy categorization. Rupert Gould's direction reinforces this atmosphere, using restrained visual language to emphasize confinement, both physical and emotional, throughout the story. By the time the narrative reaches its conclusion, there is no conventional sense of resolution. Instead, what remains is a lingering awareness of how fragile identity can be when subjected to pressure from both external events and internal contradictions. The story does not offer clear moral judgments or simple psychological explanations. Instead, it leaves behind a series of questions about responsibility, truth, and the ways in which people attempt to make sense of actions that resist comprehension. In the end, True Story operates less as a traditional crime drama and more as a meditation on the instability of narrative itself. It reflects on how lives can intersect in unexpected ways, how names can carry unintended consequences, and how the pursuit of understanding can lead not to clarity but to deeper ambiguity. The connection between Michael Finkel and Christian Longo remains one of uneasy proximity, a reminder that truth, when examined closely, often reveals as much uncertainty as it does fact.